The morning sun barely made it through the dirty windows of Tony's auto repair shop, casting long shadows across the concrete floor covered in oil stains and scattered tools. Tony wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, leaving another smudge of grease on his already dirty face. He'd been working since 6 in the morning, trying to finish Mrs. Johnson's brake job before she came to pick up her car at noon. But honest work wasn't paying the bills anymore. Tony looked around his small shop and sighed deeply. This place had been his dream for 15 years. When he first opened the doors, he thought hard work and fair prices would be enough to build a successful business. He was wrong. The big chain repair shops had moved into town 3 years ago, bringing flashy advertising and corporate money with them. They could afford to offer deals that Tony couldn't match, even though he knew his work was better. Customer after customer had apologized as they took their business elsewhere, saying they needed to save money wherever they could. Tony understood. Money was tight for everyone these days. He walked over to his small desk in the corner of the shop where a stack of bills waited for him like unwelcome visitors. The electric bill was due in 5 days. The rent on the building was already a week late. His tool supplier had called twice this week asking about payment for parts he'd ordered 2 months ago. Tony had always been proud of paying his bills on time. His father had taught him that a man's word and his credit were the most important things he owned. But pride doesn't keep the lights on. The worst part wasn't even his own struggle. It was watching what this was doing to his family. His wife Maria worked at the local diner, pulling double shifts whenever she could get them. She came home every night with aching feet and a tired smile, never complaining, but never quite hiding the worry in her eyes either. Tony had caught her looking at their bank account on her phone more than once, her face tight with concern. Their daughter Isabella was 17 and had stopped asking for things. Last month, when all her friends were getting new clothes for the school dance, she quietly said she didn't want to go anyway. Tony saw right through it. Isabella was smart and beautiful and should have been excited about her senior year, but instead she was working part-time at the grocery store, putting every dollar she earned into the family fund. The bell above his shop door hadn't rung much lately. Most days Tony found himself reorganizing his tools just to have something to do. He'd sweep the same floor 3 times and check his phone for missed calls that never came. Yesterday, he'd even thought about calling his brother-in-law Roberto, who managed a factory across town. Roberto had mentioned they were hiring, and that Tony's mechanical skills would translate well to factory work. The pay would be steady, with benefits and a pension plan, but giving up the shop felt like giving up a piece of himself. Tony had immigrated from Guatemala when he was 22, carrying nothing but determination and a tool bag his grandfather had given him. He'd worked for other people for years, saving every penny until he could afford to rent this small building and put his own name on the sign outside. Every repair he completed, every satisfied customer, every small success had been a step toward something bigger. The American dream, people called it. But dreams were expensive, and Tony was running out of money to keep dreaming. He picked up a wrench and turned it over in his hands, feeling the familiar weight of it. These tools had been his companions for decades. He knew them like old friends, knew exactly which one he needed for every job without even looking. The thought of trading them for a factory uniform made his chest tight. The phone rang, startling him from his thoughts. For a moment, his heart jumped with hope. Maybe it was a customer needing work done. Maybe today would be different. It was the landlord. "Tony, I know you're good for it," Mr. Peterson said, his voice kind but firm. "But I've got my own bills to pay. I need that rent by Friday, or we're going to have to talk about other arrangements." Other arrangements. Tony knew what that meant. After he hung up, Tony sat in the quiet shop and listened to the sounds of the neighborhood around him. Cars driving past, kids walking home from school, life going on while his world felt like it was standing still. He thought about the early days when every repair felt like a victory, when customers would recommend him to their friends and family. When Isabella was little and would sit in the corner of the shop after school, doing her homework while he worked, asking endless questions about how engines worked and why cars made different sounds. Those had been good days, simple days, days when working hard felt like enough. Tony stood up and walked to the small mirror hanging by the shop's bathroom. The man looking back at him had more gray in his hair than he remembered, and new lines around his eyes that hadn't been there a year ago. He looked tired, older, like someone carrying a weight that was getting heavier every day. But he also saw something else in his reflection, the same determination that had brought him to this country with nothing, the same pride that had built this shop from an empty building into a place where he could hold his head high. He wasn't ready to give up, not yet. Tony splashed cold water on his face and dried it with a shop rag. He had work to finish. Mrs. Johnson would be here soon for her car, and he'd promised it would be ready. Keeping promises was still something he could control, even when everything else felt uncertain. As he picked up his tools and got back to work, Tony made himself a different kind of promise. No matter what happened with the bills or the rent or the big chain shop stealing his customers, he would keep doing good work. He would keep treating people fairly. He would keep being the kind of person his father had raised him to be. Sometimes, that's all a man can do. Keep working, keep hoping, and trust that somehow things will work out the way they're supposed to. The afternoon sun was starting to fade when Tony finally finished Mrs. Johnson's brakes. He tested them twice to make sure everything was perfect. She'd been coming to his shop for 8 years, and he wasn't about to let her down now, even if she was one of the few customers he had left. Outside, he could hear the rumble of traffic and the sound of people heading home from work. Soon Maria would finish her shift at the diner and Isabella would close up at the grocery store. They'd all come home to their small apartment above the shop, tired but together. And tomorrow, Tony would open the shop again, hoping for the best and preparing for whatever came his way. The cold Tuesday afternoon wind cut through Tony's jacket as he swept the front entrance of his shop for the 3rd time that day. It was one of those gray November days that made everything look tired and forgotten. He'd been watching the street for hours, hoping to see a car pull up with someone who needed his help. But the only visitors had been a stray cat and a delivery truck that got lost looking for the hardware store down the block. Tony was just about to head back inside when he heard a sound that made him stop. Someone was knocking on his door, but not the usual knock of a customer. This was frantic, desperate knocking that sounded like someone was in real trouble. He hurried to the door and opened it to find an elderly woman standing there, her gray hair messy from the wind and her thin coat pulled tight around her shoulders. She was breathing hard like she'd been walking fast or maybe even running. Her cheeks were red from the cold, and Tony could see she was shaking. "Please," she said, her voice cracking with emotion. "I know you're probably closing soon, but I don't know where else to go. My car broke down just a few blocks from here and I'm completely stuck." Tony looked at the woman more closely. She was probably in her 70s with kind eyes that were now filled with worry and fear. Her clothes were clean but old, the kind of outfit someone wears when they're trying to look their best with what they have. Her shoes were worn but polished, and her purse was small and practical. "Of course," Tony said immediately, stepping aside to let her into the warm shop. "Come in out of the cold. What happened with your car?" The woman stepped inside gratefully, rubbing her hands together to warm them up. "I'm Dorothy," she said, trying to compose herself. "Dorothy Williams. I was driving to a job interview downtown when my car just started making this terrible noise and then stopped completely. I managed to pull over, but now it won't start at all." Tony noticed how she said job interview with a mixture of hope and anxiety in her voice. He handed her a clean shop rag to wipe her eyes, which had started to tear up from the cold wind and stress. "A job interview," Tony repeated gently. "That's important. How long do you have before you need to be there?" Dorothy looked at the old watch on her wrist, and her face fell. "I was supposed to be there in 45 minutes. I've been walking around trying to find help for the last 20 minutes. This interview, it's my first real opportunity in almost 2 years." She sat down heavily in the old chair Tony kept by his desk, and the whole story came tumbling out. Dorothy had worked at the local textile factory for 31 years before. It closed down. She'd been looking for work ever since, applying everywhere she could think of. Most places wanted younger workers or people with computer skills she didn't have, or they just weren't hiring at all. I finally got a call back last week, she explained, her hands twisting the strap of her purse nervously. It's for a receptionist, position at a small law office. The pay isn't much, but it would be enough for me to keep my apartment and maybe even buy groceries without having to choose between food and medicine. Tony felt his heart sink as he listened. He knew that struggle, all too well. The impossible choice between basic necessities that no one should have to make. He could see the desperation in Dorothy's eyes, the same look he'd seen in his own mirror lately. The thing is, Dorothy continued, her voice getting quieter, I spent my last $20 filling up my gas tank this morning. I don't have money for a tow truck or repairs or anything like that. I know that sounds terrible, but I thought if I could just get to this interview. She trailed off, looking embarrassed. Tony could tell it was hard for her to admit she was broke. People Dorothy's age had grown up believing that asking for help was something to be ashamed of, even when there was no shame in needing help through tough times. I'm sorry to bother you, she said, starting to stand up. I know you're a business, and you need to get paid for your work. I just thought maybe you could tell me what's wrong with the car and I could figure out something later. Hold on, Tony said, grabbing his jacket. Let's go take a look at your car first, then we'll worry about everything else. Dorothy's face lit up with surprise and gratitude. Really? You'd do that? Of course, Tony said, picking up his portable toolbox. That's what I'm here for. They walked the 3 blocks to where Dorothy's car was parked on the side of the road. It was an old Honda Civic, probably from the early 2000s, with faded blue paint and a few dents that told the story of many years of faithful service. Tony could tell just by looking at it that Dorothy took care of the car the best she could. It was clean inside and out, and he could see air fresheners hanging from the rearview mirror. She's been good to me, Dorothy said, patting the hood affectionately. I bought her used about 10 years ago when my husband was still alive. He always said a Honda would run forever if you treated it right. Tony popped the hood and immediately heard what the problem was before he even looked. There was a grinding, scraping sound coming from the engine area that he recognized right away. He pulled out his flashlight and took a closer look. Can you try starting it for me? He called to Dorothy. She got in the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine tried to turn over but couldn't quite make it, and the grinding sound got louder. Tony nodded to himself. He'd diagnosed this problem hundreds of times over the years. Okay, you can turn it off, he said, closing the hood and walking back to where Dorothy was getting out of the car. She looked at him with hopeful but worried eyes. What's the verdict, Doctor? Tony appreciated that she could still make jokes, even when she was clearly stressed. It's your alternator, he explained in simple terms. That's the part that charges your battery while the engine runs. When it goes bad, your battery dies and the car won't start. The good news is it's fixable. The bad news is a new alternator, and the labor to install it usually runs about $300. Dorothy's face went pale and she leaned against the car for support. $300 might as well have been $3,000 for someone in her situation. I see, she said quietly, trying to maintain her composure. Well, thank you for looking at it. I appreciate your time. I guess I should start walking to the bus stop and see if I can still make it to the interview. Tony looked at this dignified woman who was trying so hard not to break down, and something inside him made a decision that surprised even him. Here was someone who had worked hard her whole life, who was still trying to work even when most people her age were retired, and who had run into the same kind of bad luck that had been following him around lately. The difference was, Tony still had his tools, his knowledge, and his ability to help. Dorothy just had hope and determination, and right now that wasn't enough to fix a broken alternator. Wait, Tony said, an idea forming in his mind. Let me make a phone call. I think I might have a solution. Tony pulled out his phone and pretended to make a call, but really he was just thinking fast. He looked at Dorothy standing there in the cold, trying to stay strong even though her world was falling apart. She reminded him of his own mother, who had worked multiple jobs to support their family when Tony was growing up. His mother had that same quiet dignity, that same refusal to give up even when things seemed impossible. You know what? Tony said, putting his phone back in his pocket. I just remembered something. I've got a used alternator back at the shop that's been sitting on my shelf for months. The guy who ordered it never came back to pick it up, and now it's just taking up space. Dorothy looked at him with confusion and hope mixed together on her face. What does that mean? It means, Tony said, trying to sound casual about it, that I can put it in your car and get you running again. Should take me about an hour, maybe, a little more. But I told you I don't have any money to pay you, Dorothy said, her voice shaking. I can't accept charity. I've never taken handouts in my life. Tony could see the pride in her eyes, the same pride that had kept him from asking for help with his own bills. He understood that feeling completely. Sometimes accepting help felt harder than struggling alone. It's not charity, Tony said firmly. That alternator is just sitting there collecting dust. I'd rather see it helping someone than going to waste. Besides, you're not getting it for free. You're going to pay me back by getting that job and showing them what a hard worker looks like. Dorothy's eyes filled with tears, but she wiped them away quickly. Are you sure? I feel terrible about this. I'm positive, Tony said, already heading back to get his truck so he could tow her car to the shop. Besides, my grandmother always told me that when you help someone, you're really helping yourself. I never understood what she meant until I got older. The truth was, Tony had made his decision the moment he saw Dorothy's face when he told her how much the repair would cost. He had a used alternator in his shop, but it wasn't just sitting around collecting dust like he'd said. He'd bought it last month for another customer's car, but they'd decided to buy a new car instead of fixing their old one. Tony had been planning to return it to his supplier for a refund, money he desperately needed to pay his bills. But looking at Dorothy, seeing someone who was fighting just as hard as he was, but with fewer tools to fight with, Tony knew what he had to do. Some things were more important than money. It took 20 minutes to get Dorothy's car back to his shop. She sat in the passenger seat of his tow truck, nervously checking her watch every few minutes. The job interview was in less than an hour now, and they both knew it would be close. Tell me about this job, Tony said as he backed her car into his shop. What kind of law office is it? It's a small firm that handles family law mostly, Dorothy explained. Divorces, custody cases, that sort of thing. The lawyer who interviewed me over the phone seemed really nice. She said they needed someone who could relate to people going through difficult times. Tony smiled. Sounds like you're perfect for it then. You've got more life experience than most people, and you know how to treat people with respect. While Tony gathered his tools, Dorothy paced nervously around the shop. She kept looking at the clock on the wall and then at her reflection in the shop's mirror, trying to fix her hair and make sure she still looked presentable for the interview. I must look terrible, she said, trying to smooth down her coat. I've been walking around in the wind for an hour. You look fine, Tony assured her. Besides, any employer worth working for will care more about who you are than how your hair looks. Tony had changed hundreds of alternators over the years, but he'd never worked on one with such focus and determination. Every bolt he removed, every wire he disconnected, he did with the knowledge that Dorothy's future might depend on how quickly and accurately he could work. The old alternator came out easier than expected, which was a small blessing. But when Tony went to install the replacement, he ran into a problem. The mounting bracket was slightly different on this model, and he had to modify it to make everything fit properly. How's it going? Dorothy asked, checking her watch again. I've got about 30 minutes now. Almost there, Tony said, though privately he was worried. The modification was taking longer than he'd hoped, and he could see Dorothy getting more anxious by the minute. Tony worked steadily, his hands moving, with the skill that came from decades of experience. He'd learned long ago that rushing usually made things take longer, not shorter. But he also knew that every minute that passed was another minute Dorothy couldn't get back. Finally, after what felt like hours, but was really only 45 minutes, Tony tightened the last bolt and connected the final wire. He wiped his hands on a rag and looked at his work. Everything looked right, but there was only one way to know for sure. Okay, he said to Dorothy. Moment of truth. Try starting her up. Dorothy got behind the wheel and turned the key. For a terrifying second, nothing happened. Then the engine turned over and started running smooth and quiet, like it had never been broken at all. It works, Dorothy said, her face lighting up with joy and relief. It actually works. Tony smiled, feeling that satisfaction that only came from fixing something that was broken. It was the same feeling that had made him fall in love with being a mechanic in the first place. The knowledge that he could take something that wasn't working and make it whole again. "You've got 15 minutes to get to that interview," Tony said, checking the clock. "The law office is only about 10 minutes from here if you take Main Street." Dorothy got out of the car and reached for her purse. "Please let me give you something. I've got a few dollars for gas money, or I could write you a check for later when I get paid." "Absolutely not," Tony said, holding up his hands. "I told you that alternator was just taking up space. Consider it a loan from the universe." "A loan from the universe?" Dorothy asked, smiling through her tears. "Yeah," Tony said. "Someday when you're doing well and you see someone else who needs help, you'll remember this day and you'll help them. That's how you pay me back." Dorothy stood there for a moment, looking like she wanted to say something important, but couldn't find the right words. Finally, she just gave Tony a hug that caught him completely by surprise. "Thank you," she said simply. "I won't forget this. Ever." "Go get that job," Tony said, stepping back and wiping his own eyes, which had gotten a little dusty somehow. "Show them what you're made of." Dorothy got in her car and rolled down the window. "I'll let you know how it goes," she called out as she backed out of the shop. Tony watched her drive away, her old Honda running smooth and strong. He stood there in the doorway of his shop, feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't happiness exactly, and it wasn't pride in his work, though that was part of it. It was the feeling of knowing he'd done the right thing, even when doing the right thing cost him money he couldn't afford to lose. His grandmother had been right all those years ago. Sometimes when you help someone else, you really are helping yourself, even if you can't see how right away. 3 hours had passed since Dorothy drove away in her newly repaired Honda, and Tony was getting ready to close up shop for the day. The late afternoon sun was already starting to set, casting long shadows across his small parking lot. He'd spent the time after Dorothy left cleaning up his tools and trying not to think about the money he'd just given away. The used alternator had cost him $250 when he bought it from his supplier. That was money he'd been planning to get back as a refund, money that could have helped with this week's rent or maybe bought groceries for his family. But every time he started to worry about it, he remembered the relief on Dorothy's face when her car started running again. Tony was washing his hands at the small sink in the back of his shop when he heard a car pull up outside. He figured it might be a late customer or maybe someone asking for directions. He dried his hands on his shop towel and walked toward the front of the building. What he saw through the window made him stop dead in his tracks. A sleek black Mercedes had parked right in front of his shop. Not just any Mercedes, but one of the expensive ones with the tinted windows and chrome wheels that probably cost more than Tony made in 6 months. He'd worked on cars like that before, back when he had customers who could afford luxury vehicles. But it had been years since one had pulled up to his modest shop. Tony walked to the window to get a better look, thinking maybe the driver was lost and would ask for directions before moving on. But instead of leaving, the Mercedes just sat there with the engine running. Then another car pulled up behind it, a silver BMW that looked like it had just rolled off the showroom floor. Tony rubbed his eyes, wondering if he was seeing things. Luxury cars didn't come to his neighborhood, let alone 2 of them at the same time. But it didn't stop there. A third car arrived, this one a white Lexus SUV that was so clean it practically sparkled in the fading sunlight. Then came a red Audi, followed by another Mercedes, this one a deep blue color that Tony had only seen in car magazines. Within 10 minutes, Tony's small parking lot was completely filled with the most expensive cars he'd ever seen in one place. There were BMWs and Mercedes-Benzes, Audis and Lexuses, even a Porsche SUV that probably cost more than Tony's entire shop was worth. Some of the cars were so new that they still had temporary license plates in the windows. Tony stood at his window, completely bewildered. This had to be some kind of mistake. Maybe there was an event at the community center down the street and these people had gotten confused about where to park. Or maybe they were lost and would realize their error any minute. But nobody was leaving. In fact, people were getting out of their cars. Well-dressed men and women in business suits stepped out of the luxury vehicles, looking around Tony's modest shop with interest rather than confusion. These weren't people who looked lost or confused. They looked like they knew exactly where they were and why they were there. Tony's heart started beating faster. He had no idea what was happening, but whatever it was happening at his shop. He checked his appearance in the small mirror by his desk, suddenly very aware of his grease-stained coveralls and dirty hands. A man in an expensive-looking gray suit approached the front door of Tony's shop. He was probably in his 50s with silver hair and the kind of confident walk that came from success and money. Behind him, Tony could see more people gathering, all of them looking professional and important. The man knocked on the door, not frantically like Dorothy had done earlier, but with the steady, patient knock of someone who was used to being answered promptly. Tony opened the door, trying to look more confident than he felt. "Can I help you?" "Are you the mechanic who helped an elderly woman with her car this afternoon?" the man asked. His voice was polite but serious, like he was conducting business. Tony felt his stomach drop. Had something gone wrong with Dorothy's car? Had the alternator failed again? Maybe these people were lawyers, and Dorothy had been in an accident because of his repair work. "Yes, that was me," Tony said carefully. "Is everything okay? Did something happen to Mrs. Williams?" The man's serious expression broke into a smile. "Everything is more than okay," he said. "My name is Robert Thompson and Dorothy Williams is my mother." Tony blinked in surprise. This well-dressed businessman was Dorothy's son, the Dorothy who had been counting her last $20 for gas money. "I'm sorry," Tony said, still trying to process this information. "I think there might be some confusion. The lady I helped today, she was looking for work and she didn't have money for car repairs." "There's no confusion," Robert said gently. "That's exactly who I'm talking about. May I come in? I have some things I'd like to discuss with you." Tony stepped aside and Robert entered the shop, followed by several other people. Soon, Tony's small workspace was filled with men and women in business attire, all of them looking around with curious but respectful expressions. "I know this must seem very strange," Robert said, "but I got a phone call from my mother about 2 hours ago. She was crying so hard I could barely understand what she was saying at first." Tony's heart sank. "She got the job, didn't she? The interview went well?" "She got the job," Robert confirmed, smiling. "But that's not why she was crying. She was crying because of what you did for her." Robert pulled out his phone and showed Tony a picture. It was Dorothy, but not the worried, desperate woman Tony had met that afternoon. This Dorothy was beaming with joy, standing outside a small office building with her hand on her heart. "She called me immediately after the interview," Robert continued. "She told me about her car breaking down, about being stranded with no money for repairs, and about a kind mechanic who fixed her car for free because he had a spare part just sitting around." Tony felt his face getting warm. "It wasn't that big of a deal. The alternator was just taking up space anyway." "Was it?" Robert asked, but not in an accusatory way, more like he already knew the answer. Before Tony could respond, Robert continued, "My mother has been struggling financially for the past 2 years, ever since the factory closed. She's too proud to ask for help, even from her own family." "What she didn't tell you is that she's been living on savings and Social Security, trying to make every dollar stretch as far as possible?" Tony listened, beginning to understand that there was more to this story than he'd realized. "What she also didn't tell you," Robert said, "is that I've been looking everywhere for someone I could trust with something very important. Someone who would do the right thing even when no one was watching, even when it cost them something they couldn't afford to lose." Robert reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card, handing it to Tony. The card was thick and expensive looking, with elegant lettering that read, "Thompson Industries, Robert Thompson, Chief Executive Officer." Tony stared at the card, then at Robert, then at all the well-dressed people filling his shop. "Thompson Industries," he repeated slowly. "The big company with all the office buildings downtown?" "That's right," Robert said. "We're one of the largest companies in the region, and we have a problem that I think you might be able to help us solve." Tony stared at the business card in his hands, reading the words, Thompson Industries over and over again. He'd driven past their office buildings countless times, those gleaming towers downtown that seemed to reach up to the clouds. He'd always wondered what kind of people worked in places like that, and now one of them was standing in his small, cluttered shop. "I still don't understand," Tony said honestly. "What kind of problem could a company like yours have that I could help with?" Robert smiled and gestured toward the parking lot full of luxury cars. "All of those vehicles out there belong to Thompson Industries. They're company cars for our executives, our sales team, and our field supervisors. We have over 200 vehicles in our fleet, everything from sedans to trucks to specialized equipment vehicles." Tony's eyes widened as he looked out at the expensive cars again, trying to count them all. 200 vehicles was more cars than he'd worked on in the past year combined. "For the past 3 years," Robert continued, "we've been taking our vehicles to a large chain service center across town. They gave us a corporate discount and promised quick turnaround times. But we've had nothing but problems. Poor quality work, vehicles breaking down shortly after service, parts that weren't installed correctly. Last month, one of our delivery trucks broke down on the highway because they didn't properly tighten the lug nuts on the wheels." One of the other people in the shop, a woman in a navy blue suit, stepped forward. "I'm Jennifer, the fleet manager," she said to Tony. "That truck incident could have been a disaster. Our driver was lucky to get pulled over safely, but we realized we couldn't trust our current service provider anymore. We've been looking for a new automotive service provider for months," Robert explained. "But it's not just about finding someone who can fix cars. We need someone we can trust completely. Someone who takes pride in their work and treats every vehicle like it belongs to their own family." Tony felt overwhelmed by all this information. "But I'm just one person with a small shop. How could I possibly handle 200 vehicles?" "That's exactly why we're here," Robert said. "When my mother called me today crying about the kindness of a stranger who fixed her car for free, I knew I had to meet you. Anyone who would sacrifice their own profit to help someone in need is exactly the kind of person we want to do business with." Robert pulled out his phone and showed Tony another picture. This one showed Dorothy sitting in her car outside the law office, giving a thumbs up through the window with the biggest smile Tony had ever seen. "She got to the interview with 5 minutes to spare," Robert said. "And she got the job on the spot. The lawyer she interviewed with said my mother had exactly the kind of life experience and compassion they were looking for, but none of that would have happened if you hadn't fixed her car." Tony felt his throat getting tight with emotion. "I'm glad she got the job. She deserved it. What you don't know," Robert continued, "is that my mother has been too proud to accept help from me for the past 2 years. When the factory closed, I offered to help her financially, but she refused. She said she'd rather struggle on her own than be a burden to her family. I've been watching her sacrifice and worry, wanting to help but not knowing how to do it without hurting her pride." Jennifer added, "Robert has been telling everyone at the company about his mother's situation. We all knew he was looking for a way to help her while also finding a trustworthy mechanic for our fleet. When she called me today," Robert said, "she wasn't just telling me about getting the job. She was telling me about you, about how you saw someone in trouble and helped them without expecting anything in return, about how you treated her with dignity and respect when she felt like the world had forgotten about her." Tony looked around at all the people in his shop, still hardly believing this was really happening. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" "We want to offer you an exclusive contract to service all of Thompson Industries' vehicles," Robert said. "Regular maintenance, repairs, everything. The contract would guarantee you steady work and steady income for the next 5 years, with an option to renew." Tony's head was spinning. "But I told you I'm just one person. I couldn't handle that much work by myself." "That's the beauty of it," Jennifer said. "The contract would give you the financial security to expand your business. You could hire other mechanics, buy better equipment, maybe even move to a larger location if you wanted to." Robert reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "This is a preliminary contract with all the details. The guaranteed minimum payment each month would be enough to cover your current expenses, plus give you room to grow. And that's just the minimum. Depending on how much work we bring you, you could earn significantly more." Tony opened the folder. with shaking hands and looked at the numbers on the first page. The monthly guarantee was more than he'd made in his best month ever. It was enough to pay all his bills, support his family properly, and still have money left over to invest back into the business. "I don't understand," Tony said, looking up at Robert. "Why would you offer something like this to someone you just met? You don't know anything about my work or my business." "Actually, we do," Robert said. "After my mother called me, I made some phone calls. I talked to Mrs. Johnson, whose brakes you fixed last week. I called the Martinez family, whose van you've been maintaining for 3 years. I spoke with at least 10 of your current and former customers." "What did they say?" Tony asked nervously. "They all said the same thing," Jennifer answered. "That you're honest, reliable, and that you do quality work at fair prices. Mrs. Johnson said you've never once tried to sell her repairs she didn't need. The Martinez family said you always explain what's wrong with their vehicle and show them the problem before fixing it. But more than that," Robert added, "they all said you treat people with respect and kindness regardless of whether they're rich or poor. That's the kind of person we want representing our company." Tony sat down heavily in his desk chair, still clutching the contract folder. This morning he'd been worried about paying his rent. Now these people were offering him the opportunity of a lifetime. "There's one more thing," Robert said gently. "My mother made me promise to tell you something. She said to tell you that she's never forgotten what her own father taught her many years ago. He said that kindness is like throwing a stone into a pond. The ripples keep spreading out, touching places you never expected." Tony felt tears welling up in his eyes as he thought about Dorothy's words. This morning, he'd been a struggling mechanic, wondering if he'd have to give up his dream. Tonight he was being offered a chance to build something bigger than he'd ever imagined. "I need to call my wife," Tony said, his voice shaking with emotion. "I need to tell her that everything's going to be okay." As Tony reached for his phone to call Maria with the incredible news, he thought about his grandmother's words from years ago. She'd always said that when you help someone, you're really helping yourself. Today, Tony finally understood exactly what she meant. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness create the biggest miracles, and sometimes when you're willing to give what little you have to help someone else, the universe finds a way to give you back more than you ever dreamed possible. The next morning, Dorothy drove her perfectly running Honda to her first day at her new job while Tony signed a contract that would change his family's life forever. And it all started with one simple decision to do the right thing, even when it wasn't the easy thing.